We're continuing with Simon Wiesenthal's book called The Sunflower, where Simon meets an SS officer who is dying and wants to speak with a Jew. And we're at the stage where Simon is describing his time as a prisoner under the SS and how he's taken on a work detail to see that SS officer. And this first part of the book is particularly concerned with him telling the story of what it was like as a prisoner. And he's speaking, if we remember when we finished off last week, about the time at night when his friends in the bunks in bed talk about a report by an old woman. And he tells us a little bit about this story, which leads us further into his time as a prisoner before we get to the meeting with the SS officer. So we'll start where we left off last week, which is at that point where Simon is asking the question, what could she have said, talking about the old woman? Does she know when we'll get out of here or when we are going to be slaughtered? Nobody knows the answers to those questions. But she said something else, something that we should perhaps think about in times like these. She thought that God was on leave. Arthur paused for a moment in order to let the words sink in. What do you think of that, Simon? He asked. God is on leave? Let me sleep, I replied. Tell me when he gets back. For the first time since we'd been living in the stable, I heard my friends laughing. Or had I merely dreamt it? We were still waiting for the order to fall in. Apparently there was some sort of hitch. So I had time to ask Arthur how much of what I recalled was a dream and how much was real. Arthur asked, what we were talking about last night, what was it? About God? About God on leave? Josek was in the ghetto yesterday. He asked an old woman for news, but she only looked up to heaven and said seriously, O God Almighty, come back from your leave and look at thy earth again. So that's the news. We live in a world that God has abandoned, I commented. I had known Arthur for years, since the time when I was a young architect, and he was both my advisor and friend. We were like brothers. He a lawyer and writer with a perpetual ironic smile around the corners of his mouth, while I had gradually become resigned to the idea that I would never again build a house in which people would live in freedom and happiness. Our thoughts in the prison camp often ran on different lines. Arthur was already living in another world and imagined things that would probably not happen for years. True, he did not believe that we could survive, but he was convinced that in the last resort the Germans would not escape unpunished. They would perhaps succeed in killing us and millions of other innocent people, but they themselves would thereby be destroyed. I lived more in the present, savouring hunger, exhaustion, anxiety for my family, humiliations, most of all humiliations. I once read somewhere that it is impossible to break a man's firm belief. If I ever thought that true, life in a concentration camp taught me differently. It is impossible to believe anything in a world that has ceased to regard man as man, which repeatedly proves that one is no longer a man. So one begins to doubt, one begins to cease to believe in a world order in which God has a definite place. One really begins to think that God is really on leave. Otherwise, the present state of things wouldn't be possible. God must be away. And he has no deputy. What the old woman has said in no way shocked me. She had simply stated what I had long felt to be true. We had been back in the camp again for a week. The guards at the Eastern Railway Works had carried out a fresh registration. These registrations involved new dangers that were quite unimaginable in normal life. The oftener they registered us, the fewer we became. In SS language, registering was not a mere stock taking. It meant much more. The redistribution of labour, culling the men who were no longer essential workers and throwing them out, usually into the death chamber. From bitter personal experience, we mistrusted words whose natural meaning seemed harmless. The Germans' intentions towards us had never been harmless. We were suspicious of everything, and with good reason. Until a short time ago, about 200 of us had been employed at the Eastern Railway Works. Work there was far from light, but we felt free to some extent and did not need to return to the camp each night. Our food was brought to us from the camp and it tasted accordingly. But as the guards were railway police, we were not continually exposed to the unpredictable whims of the US camp patrols. The Germans looked on many of the overseers and foremen as a second-class citizen. The ethnic Germans were better treated, but Poles and Ukrainians formed a special stratum between the self-appointed German supermen and the subhuman Jews, and already they were trembling at the thought of the day when there would be no Jews left. Then the well-oiled machinery of extermination would be turned in their direction. The ethnic Germans, too, did not always feel comfortable, and some of them betrayed their uneasiness by behaving more German than the average German. A few showed sympathy towards us by slipping us pieces of bread on the quiet and seeing to it that we were not worked to death. Among those who demanded a daily stint in cruelty was an elderly drunkard called Delosh, who, when he had nothing to drink, passed the time by beating up the prisoners. The group he guarded often bribed him with money to buy liquor, and sometimes a prisoner would try to enlist his maudlin sympathy by describing the fate of Jews. It worked when he was sufficiently under the influence. His bullying was as notorious in the works as his pet witticism. When he learned that some prisoner's family had been exterminated in the ghetto, Delosh's invariable response was, "There will always be 1,000 Jews left to attend the funeral of the last Jew in Lemberg." We heard this several times a day, and Delosh was immensely proud of this particular wisecrack. By the time the various groups had formed up on the command to fall in, we, who longed for outside work, had already resigned ourselves to the prospect of remaining in the camp. In the camp, construction work went on without interruption, and every day there were deaths in the camp. Jews were strung up, trampled underfoot, bitten by dogs, whipped and humiliated in every conceivable manner. Many who could bear it no longer voluntarily put an end to their lives. They sacrificed a number of days, weeks, or months of their lives, but they saved themselves countless brutalities and tortures. Staying in the camp meant that one was guarded not by single SS men, but by many, and often the guards amused themselves by wandering from one workshop to another, whipping prisoners indiscriminately, or reporting them to the commandant for alleged sabotage, which always led to dire punishment. If an SS man alleged that a prisoner was not working properly, his word was accepted, even if the prisoner could point to the work he had done. What an SS man said was always right. The work assignment was almost finished, and we from the Eastern Railway Works stood around despondently. Apparently we were no longer wanted on the railway. Then suddenly a corporal came over to us and counted off 50 men. I was among these, but Arthur was left behind. We were formed up in threes, marched through the inner gate where 6 askaris were assigned to us as guards. These askaris were Russian deserters or prisoners who had enlisted for service under the Germans. The term askari was used during the First World War to describe the Negro soldier employed by Germans in East Africa. For some reason, the SS used the name for the Russian auxiliaries. They were employed in concentration camps to assist the guards, and they knew only too well that the Germans expected from them and what they expected from them. And most of them lived up to those expectations. Their brutality was only mitigated by their corruptibility. The capos, camp captains, and foremen kept on fairly good terms with them, providing them with liquor and cigarettes. So outside working parties were thus able to enjoy a greater degree of liberty under the guardianship of the Askaris. Strangely enough, the Askaris were extremely keen on singing. Music in general played an important part in camp life. There was even a band. Its members included some of the best musicians in and around Lemberg. Richard Rockiter, the SS lieutenant who had been a violinist in the Silson Cafe, was mad about his band. This man, who daily slaughtered prisoners from sheer lust for killing, had at the same time only one ambition: to lead a band. He arranged special accommodation for his musicians and pampered them in other ways, but they were never allowed out of the camp. In the evenings they played works of Bach and Wagner and Grieg. One day Rockiter brought along a songwriter called Zygmunt Schleiler and ordered him to compose a death tango. And whenever the band played this tune, the sadistic monster Rockiter had wet eyes. In the early morning, when the prisoners left the camp to go to work, the band played them out, the SS insisting that we march in time to the music. When we passed the gate, we began to sing. The camp songs were of a special type, a mixture of melancholy, sick humour and vulgar words, a weird amalgam of Russian, Polish and German. The obscenity suited the mentality of the Askaris, who constantly demanded one particular song. When they heard it, broad grins came over their faces, and their features lost some of their brutal appearance. Once we had passed beyond the barbed wire, the air seemed fresher. People and houses were no longer seen through the wire mesh, and partly hidden by the watchtowers. Pedestrians often stood and stared at us curiously, and sometimes they started to wave, but soon desisted, fearing the SS might notice the gestures of friendliness. Traffic on the streets seemed influenced by the war. The front line was 700 miles away, and the presence of a few soldiers was the only reminder that it was not peacetime. One Askari began to sing and we joined in, although a few of us were in the mood for singing. Women amongst the gaping passers-by turned their heads away shamefacedly when they heard the obscene passages in the song, and naturally this delighted the Askaris. One of them left the column, ran over to the pavement to accost a girl. We couldn't hear what he said, but we could well imagine it as the girl blushed and walked rapidly away. Our gaze roamed the crowds on the pavements, looking anxiously for any face we might recognize, although some kept eyes on the ground, fearing to encounter an acquaintance. You could read on the faces of the passers-by that we were written off as doomed. The people of Lemberg had become accustomed to the sight of tortured Jews, and they looked at us as one looks at a herd of cattle being driven to the slaughterhouse. At such times I was consumed by a feeling that the world had conspired against us, and our fate was accepted without protest, without a trace of sympathy. And we'll leave it there, and we'll carry on with this story and the approach to the time when Simon meets with the SS soldier next week. So Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.